Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We decided to start out our IT talk with a little bit of IT fun. So always a good way to start. Welcome to Meeting in the Middle, creating strong IT partnerships to develop successful technology initiatives in law schools. This is a bit of an old school presentation for a Cali conference these days. Talks about IT used to be very prevalent when law school IT was more of a thing. Now every single thing we do in our jobs rests on IT devices, systems, and infrastructure. Demands on IT departments are higher than ever, and at the same time, the disconnect between IT and law school stakeholders grows larger every year as IT gets more complex and technically intimidating. The purpose of this panel is to address common misunderstandings, knowledge gaps, and false assumptions in the IT law school relationship and offer strategies to overcome them. Our presenters are Carissa Vogel, who is the Law Library Director at the University of Iowa Law Library and a Professor of Instruction at the University of Iowa College of Law. In these roles, she oversees one of the largest academic law libraries in the country and has the pleasure and privilege of teaching and serving the expansive University of Iowa community. She secured over $600,000 in funding from the State Library of Iowa to develop the People's Law Library of Iowa, an accessible, easy to understand legal information website for Iowans. Before moving to Iowa, Carissa served as the Associate Dean for Library Services, Director of the Law Library, and Professor of Legal Research at Cardozo School of Law. She served on several university-wide IT committees, from strategic planning to cybersecurity, and as the law school's IT liaison, where she and Jim, who I'm going to introduce in a second, worked together extensively. And she assisted IT in running pilot projects at Cardozo before launching them for the entire Yeshiva University community. Carissa regularly presents on access to justice and preservation of legal information issues, leadership, academic management, and strategic planning. Carissa holds a bachelor's in English from the University of California, a JD from the University of New Hampshire, and an MLIS from the University of Washington. Jim Vasquez is an accomplished information technology professional and System Chief Information Officer at the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities. With extensive experience in higher education and industry leadership, Jim has successfully led IT initiatives at Yeshiva University, which includes partnering with the Benjamin and Cardozo School of Law, and served as a startup CIO for Lucian, formerly SunGard Higher Education, collaborating with community colleges, private and public universities, including the Thurgood Marshall School of Law of Texas Southern University. He has a strong background in IT governance, change management, and enterprise resource planning systems. Jim established industry alliances with Cisco, Oracle, AT&T, Sun Microsystems, ServiceNow, Apple, and Microsoft. He holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from Trinity University. He has presented on IT leadership at various national conferences, focusing on the changing role of the CIO, change leadership in higher education, IT governance, and project management. I'm Ben Carlson. I'm the Associate Director for Scholarly Data and Innovation at the University of PennCarey Law School. In this role, I act as a partner and a liaison for ITS, between ITS and the library. And I'm heavily involved in the selection and implementation of new technology platforms and solutions in the law library. In my previous role, I was the Director of Information Technology Services at the University of Connecticut School of Law. I oversaw the transition to virtual classes and services during COVID-19. I've worked on both sides of the IT library relationship to implement a new website, CMS platform, library discovery layers, lecture capture systems, classroom AV setups, and more. I presented at Cali and other conferences on API integration, web scraping, and website migration strategies for success. I received my MLS from Drexel, JD from Notre Dame, and BA from St. John's College. Now, enough, I wanted to give a real scope of the power we have in this room. Not me, those two. With that introduction in hand, I'm going to start with some questions and some conversations. So to start out, I've I've often used an iceberg metaphor to describe IT. Outsiders on the surface see a relatively small and agile island floating on top of the water, but not the significantly larger mass underneath the waves that is keeping the island afloat. Can you talk about what goes into the bottom of the iceberg of IT that may not be apparent to non-IT folks, but that underlie everything that happens in IT? Jim, you can start
Yeah,
with
I
this
guess
one.
I can certainly address this as we continue to go through budget cycles. It's a story that I have to tell and retell. One of the things that's below the surface is just the fact that IT does offer, I mean, does operate as a service management organization, and as such, it has service level agreements that need to be measured and gone through a process, and stopwatches start clicking when a request is made to make sure that the request meets an internal agreement on how fast it's delivered, and if it falls within certain cost parameters. But mostly, a lot of the unseen things from a technical perspective are dependent upon some of the new security requirements that are put in place by some of our compliance officers, our general counsels, the security of data, security of systems require a lot of at least initial research, especially when you're dealing with new vendors, new pieces of software, trying to understand how data is going to be stored and transmitted, and who's going to be using it, and how does it fall in line with current FERPA requirements. Sometimes it's HIPAA, and sometimes it's state law. And so there's a lot of checks on just about every piece of software or hardware that involves the use of data that has to go on. Amongst that, we're seeing an increasing load on what we call the network infrastructure, or the pipes. The underlying infrastructure for communications is getting more and more stress. It's kind of like our national highway system. The more cars that are available or affordable, the more cars that are on the system. And just as new systems, from Internet of Things to new security monitoring systems that people use for buildings, transmitting classes using video, high definition video, now are taking up more and more lanes on that highway. So there has to be analysis of what the traffic is going to do to an existing infrastructure. I mean, we're even converting, if you haven't already, converted to VoIP phones, which also take another lane in that network. As we come out of COVID, we're seeing staffing issues. The ability to staff quickly is becoming a problem. Obviously, the hybrid work environment has to be kind of the new normal, and if organizations aren't providing that, that dissuades some people from working at the university in favor of others that have a more progressive approach to work from home or hybrid working. And then, of course, the parable that I talk about is that the long-term and cost commitments for things continue to increase. It's the difference between, I think I've said it in other presentations, the difference between getting a free beer and a free puppy. And a free beer is pretty straightforward, but when you get a free puppy, the costs have just begun. It's not free. And so a lot of the times when we buy systems, there's not a clear understanding of the ongoing total cost of ownership that has to occur, whether it's training of staff to maintain it, additional lanes on that network to be able to present it, and training for the people who use it is an ongoing thing, as personnel are cyclical. People come in and come out. And so those are all, so every system has that kind of component of how do you maintain it long term, and those things have to be considered.
I just want to add to everything that Jim said and talk about the importance of staffing. I feel like non-IT people, or people that are just getting used to talking to folks in IT, they might think that all IT is created equal, just like people think all librarians are created equal. I think really understanding that not every IT person can solve every IT issue. So sometimes something has to go to the networking team, and that means something different than if something has to go to the security team, or if it's actually a higher level kind of governance issue that actually does have to hit like the CIO level, or is this something that's educational technologies or some kind of compliance issue. So I think one of the things that was hugely helpful when I started working with IT was just asking lots of questions and trying to start to understand what people's jobs were and how their departments worked and what kind of pressures they were experiencing, because I knew that I couldn't get the needs met for the College of Law if they were overwhelmed and stressed. And I didn't want to add to their stress. I wanted to think about being someone who is understanding, that they're like, Carissa gets it, she'll hear what we're saying, she'll understand, and will want to come to kind of a joint collaboration to try to get things done. I feel like sometimes IT folks on the outside have, or people on the outside have experience of IT folks of saying they're the ones that say no, or it's impossible, or they can't do it, or there's not enough time, or whatever. They're not the no folks. They're not saying no just to say no. Ask the follow-up questions, like, okay, you say no, what are the hurdles? Like, here is the experience that we're coming at. Here is what I'm hearing from the law school that needs done. Is there somewhere that we can talk about how that could happen, or something that I have to be able to communicate back to my stakeholders in the law school that say, this thing you're asking for isn't possible, but we have like these other different solutions.
That's great. I'm going to move the conversation now to communication. I think, Carissa, you kind of started segueing into that perfectly. When non-IT administrators and staff are consulting with IT departments about operations, initiatives, and projects, it can sometimes be difficult for everyone to get on the same page regarding what's possible, what is advisable, and what are the drawbacks or consequences of going down a given technology path. So how have both of you experienced this communication gap in your careers? And what are your strategies for successful communication to IT? And how can people on both sides prepare better to have fruitful and constructive conversations? Jim?
That's a good question, because my experience has kind of run the gamut from, attend all of our meetings to don't set foot on my campus if I don't call you. So it's just all over the place. And I think, especially in the case of those that didn't want me to set foot on their campus, as they took on more and more of the regulatory responsibility for IT in their organizations, whether it was with the accreditors, or it was some state or other agency that was looking at their compliance, that's when they started inviting me back in. And that's usually the part that they don't want to get involved in. And like I try in one of my law schools in the past, I tried to tell them it was the general counsel that said we had to do this, right? And so we've had kind of a change as IT, the technology has ensconced itself more in the day-to-day operations, not just of the general universities, but in law schools, that there has to be an ongoing communication of not only the requirements of the day-to-day operation, how to deliver instruction, how to deliver desktop and network services, but how do we stay good with our accreditors. It just varies from school to school, but that conversation now has become formalized as it enters into formal seating in the governance process. So we have governance committees, and our major customers all have a seat on those, so that everybody understands the projects and the regulations that we're trying to adhere to. And at the same time, IT understands some of the particular academic challenges that each of the colleges or universities are having to overcome. So from a communication standpoint, it's been starting a lot with informal conversation and leading into formal participation in the governance processes.
Something that I learned a lot about communication, Jim talked about, like, you know, pushing people away. My idea of kind of leadership and management and dealing with the relationship was welcome them in more. So Jim agreed over time. I don't know whose idea it was, Jim, but they'd have hours at the law school, or days at the law school. So our campus, the Cardozo campus, was far down in Manhattan. Our main campus, Yeshiva University, where Jim spent most of his time, was very far uptown. So there was a big physical disconnect, and you're not just going to kind of run into each other. So we created a system over time where this Jim would come down as the CIO, the CTO would spend time there. We have networking people that would come visit. When we were launching a new tool for students to get onto our networks, it had been a relatively complicated process, but we'd figured out kind of a way to streamline it. I invited people from the networking team to actually come into the orientation and see what our students were experiencing, and had a few situations where the networking person would say that's not would be looking at a computer and say that's not possible, like that can't happen. And I'm like, well,
it's working.
So it is, and now we have to figure out how to fix it. And my strategy had been invite IT in, help them actually see our pain points and our needs, have those kind of conversations in the space, and then let's actually roll it out for the rest of campus. So since the law school was a place where we experienced similar problems to the clinics about from around campus on privacy and delivery of service, as well as having libraries and students who are coming from, China and Africa and Europe, as well as in the United States, we kind of run the gamut of issues and said, well, we can be the place as a relatively small unit to test things out, figure out the problems, and then roll it out for everybody else. And Jim was great about communicating with law school leadership, because we actually had to get the law school and that administration used to, sometimes things are going to break and sometimes people are going to be frustrated. We have to get used to that, because there will be a good product at the end.
I want to follow up on.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say it was an interesting partnership. I really think it was because of the restaurants in Chelsea and Union Square that drew us down there. But
Jim, don't say that, because we're trying to help people that don't have Chelsea restaurants to offer to their IT people.
But no, to be more serious, exactly what Carissa said. The library, and specifically the law school, offered what we used to call a closed system. So when we were trying a new either piece of software or a new voice hardware or stuff like that, we try it at the law school first because they were willing, and secondly because we could, in a small scale, gauge what is going to happen when this scaled up. And sometimes IT departments make a mistake in trying to roll out something in a very large scale initially, rather than doing some local testing to see what problems they can anticipate as they expand the usage of whatever new system they're using. And so Carissa and her dean were always very generous in allowing us to use them as our technology guinea pigs, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I think we also we had new projects and new ideas and new needs, so we frequently have people coming to ask for additional software, additional functionality, or when we figured out some of the low-hanging issues, all of a sudden there are new needs that were emerging. So we had a lot of discussions between us about okay, we want to do this, but that is going to take a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money. What do we then not do? And have those really involved conversations. And sometimes that meant, because Jim was great at kind of creating a governance structure, over time, we kind of funneled things through that larger governance piece so that it wasn't just because you were friends with someone that you got something through, but collectively as a group, you decided this is the right way to use resources, which meant sometimes the thing that you wanted didn't happen because something else was a higher level priority.
One thing I wanted to add, as somebody who became an IT director a few years ago, my last job, with very little experience in IT, I want to go back to something Carissa said earlier, which is asking lots of questions. Like, even if you're not the director, if you're working with IT, spending the time to ask questions that seem dumb, even if at first IT is like, why are we answering these questions? That time is worth it, because if it gets you the base level understanding of where things are going, it is going to save you so much time down the line, and it's going to keep you from being ignorant of these larger issues. Like, if I had spent more time drilling down and saying exactly how does this work, like what are we worried about, what are the big challenges, answer my dumb questions now, and I promise it will pay off down the line. I really highly recommend that, especially if you're starting that kind of relationship. I think that's a good way to start, because it shows you're engaged and interested in what's actually going on. I mean, you're never going to understand it the way they do, but getting their answers to those questions is probably going to help you more than you think.
Yeah, and can I just also add to that? Like, there is a lot of shared culture. Like, we are both nerdy cultures, so the ability to talk to other people who are willing to get into the weeds of something and really understand, I think, buys a lot of goodwill on both ends, and that is kind of key to all kinds of partnerships and relationships.
I'm going to move on to back to cost. We've talked about this a little bit, but when proposing a new project that involves IT support and resources, there's sometimes a disconnect between the time and money a project seems like it should take versus what it's actually going to take. What are both of your experiences of working with administrators or stakeholders in these situations about realistic deadlines and explaining unseen factors and delays to get a project done? Yep.
Well, I think, one of my I don't know, expertises or certainly areas of experience was in project management. And a lot of times when you do the discovery phase of a project, a lot like discovery, in the law setting, there's a lot of questions being asked and a lot of scenarios being played through. And I think, all of a sudden, when you go through these questions, and there's a common theme from our previous question, you start to dig in and see what the expectations are. And that's the opportunity for people to start discussing, well, if you need to do this, and these are the types of mics you're going to need, and these cost 10 times more than the regular mics, and they're also on back order. And so there's a lot of stakeholder management and communication in any kind of project process, and especially when we were doing things that were motivated by the COVID pandemic. I mean, we had to move basically over a Passover holiday into a remote serving organization. I'm sure everybody had a different but similar type of experience in going into a remote mode. And a lot of that, we just had to sit as an organization and understand the parameters, the capabilities of the existing equipment, the cost of new equipment, new systems that did more of what was required that certainly the pandemic brought about. And so it's a lot of communication, and you're going to hear that over and over again. It may be communication in a governance setting, it may be in a project management setting, but it's a lot of back and forth so that everybody understands clearly understands what the expectations are and what's the ability to deliver. Because as we got into COVID, everybody was ordering the same equipment. from the same vendors, and all of a sudden they were getting backed up. And so it was just one of those perfect storms, or imperfect storms, that we encountered as a service organization in competition with just about everybody in the city at the same time.
Yeah, and I would say some of the additional challenges that that went on through COVID go on through a lot of our IT projects, which is that we're serving a wide range of technical comfort. So where you had to deploy resources and how to figure that out, I know was a huge struggle that we went through, because there were people that had used some kind of like webinar functionality or had recorded their classes before and knew how to turn the mics on in the room, or actually just knew how to turn on classroom equipment, or actually just knew how to turn on their computers. And we had particular challenges, given that yeshiva is an Orthodox Jewish institution. We had classes that there was no technology. There were rabbinical faculty who did not teach with microphones or computers or anything. Now, talk about a heavy lift, right? And trying to reach that entire gamut of folks, and then also the technical problems of now everyone's not coming in, but the university and its infrastructure have to go all over the city and sometimes states and sometimes countries to try to get into that space. So I think that was a very specific, man, Jim, we spent so many hours on the phone. Did our scrum start at 5:30 every morning?
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It could be on the drive in, actually. Yes.
Yeah, it was really intense. But I think that it was an intense space that really did show us, though, that even if it's not something like COVID, we're still dealing with all of those issues when we're talking about IT infrastructure, because it is infrastructure just like our buildings are infrastructure.
I'll reiterate something that Jim was alluding to, which is you can't rush these conversations. You know, that whole back and forth about cost and capabilities, don't rush through it because people are annoyed. That's, I think, an easy thing to do. Like, oh, they're annoyed, I just don't want to deal with it. Like, you need to explain to them, if they want things faster, if we could do it faster, but then all these things will happen because of that. Like, make those consequences clear from the IT side or from the other side, and say, if we don't get this by this date, this is going to be a problem legally, or it's not going to serve our goals. You know, being open and honest in those conversations as much as possible, I have found to be the big silver bullet. We need to talk about privacy and security, especially in the law school setting. When spinning up any new systems or services, everything is a potential security threat. Every new service, everything connected to the internet is going to cause problems, especially when there are higher risks of legal liability, when we have legal clinics and their data to worry about. FERPA is obviously ever present in law school data protection. So what are the keys to providing full support while also staying responsible and compliant with law and other obligations? Jim?
Well, I think we've tried to systematize. We tried and we succeeded, and I'm starting a new venture and starting from scratch again. It's systematizing the approach and making privacy part of the discussion. Whether it's the acquisition or the use of a particular technology, it's not an add-on. It's you start with it, and we've got. We're in a position now where there are some standard documents. You may have heard of the HECVAT, real hard acronym to say, but it's it'll put out by EDUCAUSE that gives you the standard things to ask and certify of the vendors who are selling you products that they comply with. A lot of the times, you know, the vulnerability that you encounter, and we encountered it directly, is not necessarily in your own data center. It's with services that you've contracted for, or you know, third party products, SaaS products, and your data is sitting out in their data center, and they have to be able to certify to you and to your auditors and to your accreditors that student data it has the same level of seriousness and protection that if it were on your own campus. And that's one of the things that has been accelerated by the pandemic, because now we're talking about personal computers that are being used at people's homes, outside of our network, outside of our firewalls, that still need to be protected. So it has, like I said, accelerated the concern and the need for extending privacy capabilities beyond the perimeter of our physical network. So that's some of the things that are starting. I know Carissa will tell you some interesting stories about the clinics and using a shared drive and that sort of thing. And those are the kinds of things that have to be rethought in this new regulatory environment.
Yeah, so we had a survey that we had put together, and one of our, I don't know which of the computing committees that I was on that put it together, but we thought we need to have some sense of how many devices people are using, what kind of devices people are using, how they're using technology and services. Do they, also a little bit of an information campaign, do you know about, one YU or whatever, whatever the particular thing was, to remind people as well as to see what they knew. So we got those survey results, and we kind of put some plans together about how to serve different needs, and then we had just some off-the-wall kind of requests come from a number of our different clinics that were not captured in any way by the survey instrument that we had put together. So one of the things that we learned was the survey is the starting point to the conversation, not necessarily the end. If you have particular groups that you know, or you can ask some questions and they're using things in particular ways, or have particular bits of software or particular privacy concerns that they have to be aware of, go and actually shadow some of those people, because one of the things we found out was when we went into the clinics and did that work, this person's using a piece of equipment that we were not aware of in any way. And it's like, well, what's that? Oh, well, we just use that for X, Y, and Z that had client communication on it, and like, oh, when we take this to the courts and do this, and you're like, okay. And then you text Jim and go, hey, we need to put this on the agenda for the scrum, because I think we have a major problem here that we have to talk about. And some of that was user information, like they just had to be educated on something, and some of it were things that we actually had to address, and then that made us ask further questions for some of the other social work clinic and some of the others if there were similar kinds of issues. So spending that extra little bit of time and understanding you can collect a certain amount of data, but then there is a lot of power in like physically actually seeing what people are doing. And terror, and also terror.
I think to follow on to that notion, we had I think we had just started implementing or further implementing Microsoft Teams. I mean, it had been around, but it took on a new urgency and certainly significance in collaboration across the university system. And as we added components to Microsoft Teams, there were extensions that could scan for what it thought was PII. And I think that first night that we got it in, the law school just started pinging all over the place. And I think it was the next morning where I said, do you know about this? That you've got data that has social security numbers, contact numbers, first and last name.
And Jim, you were also talking in one of our conversations about how you think differently now about like cybersecurity and what it is that you're trying to get your team kind of oriented to, that there's not winning a war.
Yeah, well, I use the term, it's an arms race, and I know that's somewhat pejorative, but it is an arms race. As soon as we come up with a new security mechanism, somebody finds a way to get around it, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And at some point, there's the realization that, I have to be right all the time, and the attacker only has to be right once, and for there to be a real mess. And so we're starting to think of new ways to kind of circumvent that. And I think we're going to have to get used to the fact that sometimes the best way is the old way. And those who can remember the bad old days of dumb terminals, they're gone, but there's a new world of smart terminals that allow us to access virtual computers. And so you can set up virtual desktops that are not necessarily have the same type of attack vector that a laptop would have, or a computer at somebody's house on a Comcast network per se. And so we're looking at some of these alternatives. The network speed of some of these services, virtual desktops, is now rivaling gaming speeds. And so we're having to take a look at what can we, business not as usual. Maybe we don't buy PCs anymore. Maybe we buy diskless workstations that access virtual computers that can be wiped at the first sign of viruses or malware. And those are easier to maintain, easier to protect. And, if they're fast enough, and this is the thing that we have to test, the user doesn't realize they're not on a real computer, they're on a virtual computer. And so they can download things and manipulate them in Excel and do other types of data work that would normally expose somebody or data. And these new solutions, provide a way kind of around that. But it is a new way of working. And so that's kind of something that we're going to have to look at, because the arms race is very costly. And so for every dollar we're spending on defense, it's not going into the classroom. It's not going into instruction.
That's a great segue, I think, to talking about the future. So what does the future hold for IT in higher education? I mean, what do we have to look forward to? What do we have to worry about more? And how can law schools help?
Yeah, that's a good question. We talked a little bit about virtualization. Obviously the large language models. I don't know, Carissa, you've given your presentation yet, but certainly
No, that's tomorrow.
Okay, it's tomorrow. All right. So
And there's a lot of talk about large language models already started with the keynote.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So those are things we are looking at, that from an instructional perspective. That's, how are those going to be leveraged? Because I remember when, pocket calculators came out, and how there was an uproar that we cannot allow these in the classrooms. And now you wouldn't think about teaching calculus without a graphing calculator, right? And so it's just another tool that we're going to have to figure our way out of instructionally, on how we use it and leverage it to deliver instruction. And so LLMs is in that role. We're finding new ways to do exams. That's always been a kind of an issue. How are you going to do this when people can ask? I mean, it's always been there. You can do a query on Google, and now you have certainly a better assistant using some of the LLMs. And as I tried to explain to my provost, I was showing him a video on Copilot, and if you haven't seen what Copilot is going to do, and Copilot is the Chat GPT extension that will be inserted into all of the Microsoft products, and there's going to be an equivalent one on the Google side as well. You can't escape this, and it will be expected that your students know how to use these things when they enter the workforce. So it's not something we can avoid. It's just trying to figure out how we're going to deal with it and use it as an instructive fashion. Law schools have a specific, or certainly a higher demand at looking at this, since you are such a text-driven industry, a writing industry. And I'll let Carissa talk about some of the ideas she had, because they're crucial in making this thing work.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say one of the things that Jim started with us at Cardozo was a certificate, or we were envisioning a virtual class that would really focus on privacy law for IT professionals, and something that we could be figuring out, how do we teach people some of the basic law and then also blend it into compliance. So what do IT professionals need to know about torts and civil procedure, and some things about constitutional law and administrative law, and then get into the weeds about privacy and other things. So I think that Cardozo was right in thinking very clearly and entrepreneurially about that kind of work, but I think there is a wide open marketplace for law schools that want to jump into those spaces and figure out how we provide some of that information to them. I think the thing that I think we actually have to understand in all of our jobs is, as I mentioned before, IT is kind of basic infrastructure, and you have to know more about technology, and this is like a room that obviously knows this, but some of us are here, casually, that maybe have not as much of an understanding of tech, but keep leaning into the technology understanding, because we will increasingly need more people who can translate and bridge those gaps. And I feel like in my position, I was a translator who could speak a little bit of the IT language, and I could speak the law school language, and I could tell each of the groups what the other one was saying, and that was a critically important role. And I think the more that that you can be in those roles of translators for any of the different groups you deal with, the more secure you'll be in your job, as we're thinking about those things, and the better off you will be in getting your work done and helping your institution get its work done as well.
I think those are great points. We just to follow up on it, there's a lot of technology in the law, but there's also a lot of law in the technology, and educating people on concepts like a reasonable person standard, what is negligence, those types of things. It's become increasingly important that most of the elements of IT understand that. And going back to one of the questions we had earlier about how do we bridge the gaps, providing that type of certification. I think at Cardozo we were looking at an MJ or an MLJ. I don't even remember the initials anymore.
Like yep.
Where it was a master's program, and it may have been a law school light, but it introduced some concepts that have to constantly be in the minds, especially of CIOs and their deputies. and even those people dealing with enterprise applications that are dealing with the input and handling of student data, faculty data, employee data. And it's not enough to just go to a 1-hour Department of Education seminar on FERPA. This is becoming increasingly complex, requiring chief data officers, chief data privacy officers, chief risk management officers. So it's a thing. It's a big thing.
Well, that's the end of our planned session. So I'm opening up to questions.
Where's dinner?
What?
Where's dinner?
Yeah, right. Catherine?
So obviously some law schools have a single administrator that is administering library and IT, and others have those separated. Based on your experiences, do you have an opinion about like what's a strong model, or is that institution specific?
My first reaction is, how big are you? The bigger you are, the more staff you can afford to have on your side. Most of us have to deal with very limited budgets, so I think it's kind of size dependent and budget dependent. And Carissa, you've been to more law schools than I have, so I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say it's really hard to do the job of a law library director, and with especially if you have obligations as a faculty member, and do the job of the like main IT person or that liaison position together at the same time. I think that it helps you in certain ways because you know all of the IT people and they know you and they take your phone calls. If you've done it right, they take your phone calls pretty fast and they're willing to like go to lunch or grab a coffee with you. I also think that just speaking for myself, there were times where I was purely IT and I was not doing what I needed to do on the law library side.
Yeah.
What we needed to make happen. And I also oversaw ed tech, so all of the classroom technology as well, and that was a lot.
Yeah,
It's a lot for one person to do both, I think.
Yeah, and I think it was possible more in the earlier days. Yeah.
Carla, you're just a superhuman person and can do all of those things. So we have to talk about the rest of us, not the unicorns among us.
But I'll actually back up if they're not combined into one role, that relationship needs to be maintained. Yep. Like you have to be constantly talking and not being frustrated with lack of action. Like it's a long process of building that relationship at every institution where I've been in a liaison role. It's frustrating at first because there's just a lack of understanding. So why can't they do this? They're not explaining. After a year, you start to speak the same language, but that's only with constant communication.
So we have a question from the Q&A. Do either of you know if conversations are taking place at your organizations on the possibility of offering ChatGPT accounts to students and faculty?
Right now, they're wanting me to make sure that I have a way in Blackboard to see if they're using ChatGPT to turn in their papers, or using them as content sources for papers. But so there is no desire for us to provide ChatGPT accounts. I think what's going to happen, and this is just I'm just speculating. I think that the LMSs are going to have to start to incorporate some amount of AI in their systems to supplement what they're already doing. But I don't know that for a fact yet.
So I don't, in my current role, I am not the director of IT, and I at the College of Law, and I'm not sure totally what some of the larger IT conversations are. But I can speak from a faculty perspective that there are very strong feelings, and some are like, this is a tool that we have to just accept is going to be a thing, and now we have to change maybe some of the ways that we're designing assessment. And then there are those that are just like, lock it down, get away from me, push it away. So so those of us that are more in the, this is a tool that we have to understand, are trying to do presentations to our faculty colleagues of like research that we're doing and ways that we're working with the tool. Because I feel like a lot of times the no pushing away is just like of fear and scary, and this seems overwhelming. And if we can, speaking as colleagues, speaking as friends, and not going in with judgment and just saying, okay, let's talk a little bit about what we see, let's make this less scary. I think we can get to a different place. I don't know of anyone that's talking about like going that far into ChatGPT. I think it's more like, how do we manage this?
Well, and like I said, I think I said earlier, and when I had my discussion with the provost, when I start talking about things like Copilot, our license with Microsoft allows student to have total our students access to all of the Microsoft Office tools and collaboration tools, and within 6 months they will all have an element of ChatGPT built into them, whether it's Word, PowerPoint, Excel. Even email will have that built into it. So they won't need a ChatGPT account. It'll come courtesy of Microsoft, and more than likely Google will follow suit as well with its tools.
Yeah, Carla.
That's all I was going to say. Is I think the question is not, are schools going to provide ChatGPT because of specifically Microsoft? And if you have an enterprise license where your students, like we do at the University of Washington, have access, as Jim mentioned, to all that, like, it doesn't matter. They're going to have it anyway.
Yeah.
That's the actual question.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? Change our enterprise licenses to say?
Yeah, that's
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
I think that's also an education piece, because I think people might have the understanding that, oh, we can shut this down, people that don't actually understand IT and enterprise systems and
Licensing.
Yeah.
Contracts. What?
Yeah. Interesting.
Any questions?
So we have the same thing, right, with the free accounts under our license, and we could not deliver Copilot, right? We don't deliver some aspects of teams or groups or whatever has been chosen to be locked down for whatever reason. But if we don't, so the people that have access to money can buy their own
Right.
accounts. And now we created this equity issue where, we're really dividing who gets what and totally kind of not paying attention to what we're doing. So, it's better to say, we're not just creating great students that don't cheat, we're supposed to be creating great employees that know how to use tools.
Right.
So,
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I had this conversation with my CFO, and after he played with them for a while, his response was, if you're not using these, you're wasting time. Okay. I can't have you wasting time. And so my response, I turned that around to the provost, is how can we present these as tools that we're going to be using in the workspace and prohibit student use of them? I mean, it just seems inconsistent intellectually and practically, so those are the discussions going on.
Yeah, I think that intellectual point is really key. Like, we're in the business of education, and we're in the business of academic exploration and curiosity. Why would we suddenly say, no, not this thing, you can only do this?
But even if we
Right.
weren't in the business of exploration and academic curiosity, the labor market and the ABA demands that we, in fact, produce practice-ready
Right.
graduates. So, to me, that's the answer. ABA compliance and employment, the end.
All right. Thank you so much to Jim and Carissa for
Thanks,
joining
Ben.
us, and thanks for everybody for coming.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Frida.
Thank you.
Jim, I'll send you a thing.